So welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are getting towards the end of the day, but before we move to the third working session, we actually have a very special agenda item, which is the Airport Carbon Accreditation 10th Anniversary Ceremony. I hope you have enjoyed the special cupcakes of a coffee break for that. So to lead us through the ceremony, it gives me great pleasure to invite again to the stage Olivier Jankovic, Director General of ACI Europe. So Olivier, the stage is yours yet again.
Thank you very much, Filippo. I'll be brief. What we wanted to do now is just mark the 10th anniversary of our program, Airport Carbon Accreditation, before we kick off to the next session, which is going to go into the core of sustainability. And it seems fitting to take a moment to look back on another pledge we made as an industry back in 2008, and the decade of climate action by the airport industry since then. We actually started this with a promise we made, it was I think in 2007, when the global airport industry committed to reduce its carbon emission with a kind of vision to become carbon neutral. And that was followed by ACI Europe taking the commitment to deliver an independent program to help airports deliver on that commitment, to actually give a tool to airports to do the job. We launched that in Europe at this event 10 years ago in Manchester. We were all looking a bit younger. That was the height of the economic and financial crisis, and I must say at the time, airport carbon accreditation somehow defied the odds. Within 5 years, though, it made it around the world. It became a global program. We extended it to all ACI regions with the support of ACI World. So this moment is to celebrate how far we have come since then in that decade. The fact that basically now climate action is really integrated into airport management. It's about the early adopters, the airport operators who proactively sought to be the first accredited in their country and the first one that reached carbon neutral status. And it's about also acknowledging the plethora of collaborative activities that are at the heart of anyone wanted to reduce CO2 emission on the airport side. Of course, a lot of new ideas came along the way, coming from the airports themselves. It's been a great tool also to exchange best practice and to create a community of carbon-accredited airports. At launch, 10 years ago, we had only 24 airports that said they would apply to the program in the first year. And 10 years on, we're at 275 airports in 71 countries that are accredited. 147 of them are in Europe, which means that Europe's airports are really leading globally on climate action. In fact, I think most of you to come here would have traveled through 1 or 2 or maybe 3 airports that are carbon accredited. And our host, Hermes Airports, are the latest one to become carbon neutral just today, together with Copenhagen Airport last week. For those of you wondering, the independently verified carbon reduction achieved this year by Europe's airports is a bit more than 133,000 tons of CO2. That's a 7% decrease on emissions under their direct control. So thank you again for all airports that have been supporting and engaged in the program. I think it's great we continue to go with the work. And I will close with a little video. We initially produced an award-winning program animation that says life is about movement. And to mark the 10 years of the program, we wanted to build on that with a new animation to mark the anniversary. So here it is.
How often do you think about the things you would like to change? It could be about closing the gap between who you are and who you want to be. And it can take time to realize what, why, and how you want to change. It may be a habit, a process, your way of interacting with others, or your entire lifestyle. But the first step is to say it out loud. I am going to do this. That's when an idea crystallizes and commits you to action. Then comes the research and investment in the right tools, And then it's up to you to get on with it. Data can provide motivation on the daunting nature of the challenge. It can help structure and guide your efforts, and occasionally remind you of the progress you're making. As change starts to become clear to you and those around you, others start to take notice and follow your lead. That's when an idea goes beyond individual action and becomes something more significant. A virtuous circle that's inspiring others to address the problem too. Over time, it might even conquer the world. A global problem needs a global solution. It's 10 years since we embarked on this journey of self-improvement with an independent program that empowers airport operators to address their carbon footprint. In that time, airports big and small, far and wide, have invested in climate action, achieving genuine reductions in their CO2 emissions. And their engagement is intensifying. There's still a lot to do. So, what are you waiting for?
That's it. So there's, of course, a clear message for those airports who have not joined the program yet to come on board. But that's now the transition to the next panel on sustainability. I'd like to invite my friend Andrew Charlton, who's going to be our moderator, to introduce your panelists and kickstart the discussion. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Olivia. Ladies and gentlemen, a few months ago, or a month or so ago, Olivia rang me and he said, look, we've got this great new initiative coming up at the ACI meeting. We're going to go to zero carbon. He said, we're going to have the 10th anniversary. I think we should talk about sustainability and I think we should talk about zero emissions because we need to talk about it. So you'll be pleased to know that we are now going to start talking about, we've been talking about nothing but sustainability, have we, all day. So yet again, ladies and gentlemen, we have another session on sustainability, but we have, I think, a slightly different twist this afternoon. I'd like to re-invite Willie Walsh back up onto the stage, but also Patrick Key, who is the Executive Director of EASA, Bill Hemming, who's from the NGO Transport and the Environment, Andrew McMillan from Heathrow Airport, and Hubert, I've forgotten yours, Martin, from Airbus. So now we have a situation where perhaps we can start to talk about where all of the rubber meets the road on this, because we have both the OEMs and an NGO, well, an OEM and an NGO on the stage to also talk about it, as well as an airline, as well as an airport. And I think the other group that's managed to miss out on a lot of this today have been the air traffic control people. A mystery to me why the air traffic control people, or as we call them, the ANSPs, please excuse my Australian accent, are missing out on some of this adventure. Because for better or for worse, this has become a topic that we cannot avoid. This has become a topic that you can't get off the front of the paper. This has become a topic where politicians are engaged in a way that they've never been engaged before. And this has become a topic where the aviation industry, whose position on this has historically been this far but no further, and Corsia, which was an epoch-making and a breakthrough when it happened, when it started, but is now starting to look ever so slightly insufficient. So I'm not going to call this exam questions. I'm not going to call this anything else, but I do think that there's a lot of issues that we need to go through. We need to talk about, is Corsia a reduction scheme or is it an offset scheme? Because you can't be both. You can't be both. Is Corsia a busted flush, in fact? We need to talk about airframes, we need to talk about biofuels. I would very much like to talk about air traffic control systems, airspace capacity, all of those issues. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we have a licence to continue to grow, or are we at peak indifference? I think it's fair to say that ACI isn't at peak indifference. The fact that we've had 4 sessions today, all of them about this topic, indicates that perhaps we're paying attention. But whether the rest of the industry is at peak indifference is perhaps a question putting in different ways. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's kick off. Let me start perhaps, Bill, by asking you, how did you get here today?
I flew.
On an aeroplane?
I flew on an aeroplane.
Gosh.
Not really many alternatives, right? I could have
Well, you could have
started a couple of days ago, right? I could have taken a ferry, but I flew. And I don't think that's such a strange thing. I think it was said at the previous session, right, that aviation does a whole lot of good in the world, and I'd be the first to agree with that, having grown up in Australia and lived around the world.
He
I don't think the question...
He didn't just grow up in Australia, ladies and gentlemen. He grew up in Tasmania.
Yeah.
Which is an island next to a continent.
I don't think it's a question of whether aviation is a good force in the world or not. It is clearly isn't a good force in the world. And I think to have conferences like this, whether they're in Cyprus or anywhere else, to do business around the world, flying is the way to go. 40 years ago, it was very different. I think the question is not whether we should fly. Maybe the question is how much we should fly, but the question really is whether we should fly clean or not, and I think that's the fundamental question.
Okay, that seems to lead us almost directly to you there with flying clean.
Yes.
Do you see is that possible? How are we going? Willie in the last session I think it was you, Willie, that made this point that for better or worse, aircraft need fossil-based fuel.
You should just allow me a marketing session for Willie.
Yeah.
As a nice word he said on A321 XLR, and the point-to-point, welcome to discussions, Willie, on this topic again in the future, whether you wish. More seriously, everybody, I think first, congratulations to this event and congratulations to the commitments taken at the airport. I think looking at environmental aspect from an end-to-end perspective, yes, we have different actors in the industry with different problematics. As Willie said, problematic of airlines are slightly different from the problematic from the airport, which are also different from the manufacturers. But we all now together try to get into those problematics. And this may be new compared to the past, and I heard many times collaboration. And maybe we can come back later. I guess your questions are all around technology. What's our plan? I have been interested to see that electrification has been seen from a manufacturer perspective as the element for the future. Electrification is certainly something what we consider at Airbus for urban air mobility or very short-range aircraft, very small, very short. If you were to think about a single-aisle aircraft with batteries, if you were dreaming of an order of magnitude of 30 in progress of the densification of the battery, you would still not put half of the people to 1/3 of the distance of a single-aisle. So electrification, as the normal way to operate today, I don't think is the solution on its own. We are investing, as has been mentioned this morning, through hybridization. Electrification technology is mainly hybridization to see the value, and this is the IFAN X program with a 2 megawatt power engine on a 2 megawatt battery on a test bed, because this is technology feasibility, to investigate elements like high voltage on board. 3,000 volts on board, high altitude is a problem in itself, and we need to think about keeping safety at the level that we offer safety today to all our passengers. We have to look at thermal problematics linked to all those elements, and this one way for us to think about. After that, with hybridization, help at takeoff, landing phase in additional efforts. The interesting thing of electrification and electric motors on board, it also offers a brand new domain in terms of the airframe structure. If you had distributed power onto an aircraft, you can dream, and I guess lots of people can dream of very different aircraft they have seen in many different films or cartoons when they were young. Flying wings, distributed power offers another way to think about how can we gain efficiency. But This is also to be investigated. Electrification, and through electrification we're talking about what's the power density for propulsion. There may be other source of power density for propulsion, and we have to think about, let's not put all our eggs into one basket, and you have seen that Airbus has decided to join the Hydrogen Council, because we're looking at, and I think we should hear more about it, it's not just us transitioning, it's a cross-sector transition. How does the fuel energy producer sector get out of the situation? What are the most promising routes? What are the sources of energy that will be renewable for the aircraft in the future?
Well, what are the most promising sources of energy for the aircraft of the future?
Well, I think today my message is we are here to investigate all of them. They have different. Electricity is something where density is of the matter, and maybe sustainability, if you look at the end-of-life issues of all those products later. But there may be other sources. There may be, I mentioned hydrogen. There are other sources of energy which could be dense. There are also solutions that could apply directly to existing fleet, which is very important. Introducing a new technology in the market will certainly help grow later, once people renew their aircraft. Introducing technologies that can be applied to the existing fleet, and if you look at, we've mentioned sustainable fuel as something to help decarbonize. 50% blend as an objective is already great, maybe it can go later, but already if we all together were able to grow the blend into 50%, we would have done tremendous progress into decarbonization of the industry. And there are other sorts of fuels. We've discussed, I've mentioned hydrogen. Why? Because renewable power like wind and solar power is not always available at the time when you need it. So when the wind blows, it's not always the peak hour for consumption. How can I store this energy? And a lot of countries have looked at, I can store by producing hydrogen. This hydrogen, if I go on one-way hydrogen production, carbon capture, and carbon capture has been mentioned this morning, and I think we need to discuss it in more detail in other forums, I think. You recombine them, it needs a lot of renewable energy, but then you produce power to liquid. The question will be there, the equation of the economy. Up to now, I think we've been brilliant in our energy consumption progress, because economy was going along with ecology. I mean, aircraft operating costs, demand, reduction of fuel consumption. I had difficulties to come here because we have a fuel efficiency seminar at Airbus, and it's quite interesting to see that we are hosting more than 70 airlines for 3 days workshop to find all the options to reduce fuel efficiency. And you see competitors sitting together and exchanging their best practice, which is, I think, very promising in the future. We can encourage as a manufacturer and get all their feedback to see what we need to work in the future.
But if, let's say at that meeting in Toulouse yesterday, someone came up with an absolutely brilliant solution, complete breakthrough, how quickly could we get it into our fleet, into the aircraft generally? So is that a question for you, Patrick, perhaps? If someone comes up with a brand new, brilliant idea, how long do or putting it even more gently, if the Wright brothers ran into your office tomorrow and said, got this brilliant new invention called the aeroplane, how quickly could we get it into the air, do you think?
In a matter of days.
Right. And how quickly could we... All right, my mistake. I should have asked you the question. How quickly can we get it into the air certified?
It depends on the type of modifications which are needed. If it's just an operational best practice, then it's immediate. There is no need for us to certify. It's just a matter of training the crews and making sure that the operational procedures are known and things like this. If it is going towards hydrogen fuel, then of course it's going to take a lot of time, not only to develop the research and development and all the things which are needed in order to have a mature technology, but then for the agencies such as ourselves to ensure that it's safe, and then it takes a bit of time. So just to give you an order of magnitude, the A320neo, for instance, was certified in 7 years, okay, which was the time needed for Airbus to mature the design and then go through all the different phases, test flights and things like this with us. It took them 7 years. So, but it's you could argue that it's a minor change because it's a change of the engine, but it's always much more complex than that. It's a question of changing the engines, but also the structure, the nacelles, and then usually there are changes in the cockpit as well. There are changes to everything, to the operations, and therefore of the training and so on and so forth. So it's a very complex topic. The winglets took much less time. So it really depends on the complexity of the changes which are needed. But what I can say is that if some airlines come up with a best practice, operational practice, that I don't know, that reduces the fuel consumption, then it's very easy to implement because it's not regulated. The framework is regulated, but the way in which you operate the aircraft is by and large left to the discretion of the airlines.
And what about Airbus comes up with a brilliant new idea tomorrow, and it's going to take a certain amount of time to get done. But in the meantime, Willie's got 200 brand new 73 Maxes that are going to fly around for, 30 years, I presume.
25 years.
Yeah, 25 years. Is the problem that the OEMs make our aircraft too well and that they don't finish up fast enough? Is that the solution, to make them with a bit more redundancy? If they were Apple, that's what they'd be doing, just saying.
So you're into single-use plastic,
single-use airplanes. Single-use. Well, I mean, single-use but recyclable, surely.
But this is the challenge, it's getting that balance between clearly the amount of money that gets invested into developing a new technology aircraft, and with respect, the time it will take to make a return on that investment. And if the manufacturers don't see that that's going to be a viable business case, they're not going to do it. So we as an industry, there's got to be push from our side, which we do. We've been pushing the manufacturers to improve in terms of, the noise performance of aircraft, the fuel performance of aircraft, the engine manufacturers with NOx. So it is push and pull, and that is critical. But you don't want to say to an airline, don't invest today. Continue to use what you have, because 10 years from now there's going to be something much better. So you have a 10-year period where, in effect, you could be operating in a suboptimal environment, waiting for the next. And then the problem, as we've seen, because let's be honest, that's exactly what we did at IAG, at British Airways. We delayed and decided not to take the 777-300ER because we were going to wait for the 787, 8, 9, and 10. So in 2007, when we could have taken the 777, and ultimately did end up taking it because the 787 ends up being delayed. Had I known in 2007 that there was going to be a delay to the 787 program, I would have ordered 777-300ERs. But it's an easy decision to take in retrospect. It was the right decision for us to take, as we saw, to skip a generation, to move to a better performance, and we did. We evaluated what the performance was going to be over a period of time. Did this, 7 years to do the certification on a NEO, which for most people in this room is just an A320. I don't think people fully appreciate the complexity involved, as Patrick has set it out, in terms of, introducing change on what for a lot of people would be seen as a relatively small scale. They would have seen it as new engines, but it was a lot more complex than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill?
Yeah, I mean, the solution is staring us all in the face. We could talk here all afternoon about technology, and we probably should, because there's a lot more that can be done on technology. But technology alone is not going to get us anywhere near where we need to be from an airport's or an industry's perspective to get to zero carbon. The answer is fuels, and regrettably Europe has been trying a fuel solution for road vehicles for the last 10 or 15 years, and it's turned out to be an absolute disaster. We can't develop good sustainability criteria. Road fuels are half full of palm oil, and they're in fact more polluting than diesel. So ironically, whilst it's been an enormous failure on the road, the fuel solution is the one that's staring this industry in the face. And it will serve the purpose of airlines like IAG, because you won't have to buy new aircraft. Yeah. It serves the purpose of Airbus and Boeing, because you won't have to redesign aircraft and go to the expense of trying a hydrogen solution, which clearly, obviously, should be investigated. So we have drop-in biofuels. They need to be developed, and they need to be brought to the market. There's only a certain amount of wastes and residues, and IAG and others are working on those, and that's a very good start, but it's not going to be the ultimate solution. We've looked at what decarbonising aviation by 2050 could mean, and it means some level of biofuels, maybe 10 or 13% of European outbound demand by 2050. If you wanted to fill the whole industry in Europe with biofuels, you would need to take over all the land in India, which is not very likely to happen. So we need to move beyond biofuels to the power-to-liquid solutions that Airbus talked about. So the only problem with the power-to-liquid, which can get pretty close to zero carbon as long as the energy is green, and as long as the CO2 capture that combines with the hydrogen you make from the energy is from the air and not from a steel or a cement factory, is the cost. But it's only the cost of the fuel. We work on all modes of transport, including shipping. Shipping, everyone says aviation is the most difficult sector to decarbonise. There's no doubt it's a very, very difficult sector to decarbonise. But if you look at shipping, they've got three problems, not one. They're going to have to build new ships, because hydrogen and ammonia will have to be carried in the ship in a different way. They're going to have to develop these fuels, which are expensive, almost expensive as power-to-liquid, a drop-in fuel for aviation, and they're going to have to redo the infrastructure at the airport. In that respect, aviation has a good deal. You've only got to do one.
The seaport, you meant, not
yes,
the airport.
The airport.
But Andrew, as an airport person, is this of interest to you?
Yes. I think what this conversation illustrates in part is that we don't quite know what the solution is. It's going to be a mix of things. And we therefore need to be going on a number of different options at the same time. But the other bit that comes out of here has got to be commercially rational. This has got to work in terms of the cost base for airlines to actually fly it and for consumers and passengers to fly it. And we've got to be sensible about the infrastructural dimensions of that too. So if you take it from an airport point of view, before we start investing huge amounts on electrification or something of that sort, we need to know what the path looks like. And it surely has to be part of the mix to be working with the existing fuel infrastructure and the existing aircraft infrastructure to make that work. So we are very interested in things like the BA with Velocis, with Virgin's doing some with LanzaTech in terms of creating biofuels. But if you look at the kind of percentages that we're talking about at the moment, I think it's something like 0.05% of fuels are biofuels. We're talking about they're getting to kind of 3, maybe 5, 6, 7% in the 2020s, 2030s. If we could get that going at pace, that would make a very big difference. But to get going at pace, I think you've got to have some kind of a goal you're shooting for. You've got to have some kind of collaboration going across the industry, and you've got to work on that. And you've got to have government helping to make that happen and providing some long-term stability and certainty and positive incentives to go in that direction. And I do actually take optimism from what you see in the UK in other industries, where you've seen that happen. You've seen things move faster, and you've seen cost come down far faster, where you've actually had that certainty and stability happening. But you've got to do this with a commercial lens as well as a pure technological one, I think.
Unfortunately, the fuel price is moving in a way that'll make it much more commercially attractive any minute.
No, actually, the fuel price, it's been commercially attractive for some time. I think what we've had to do is to bring together the technology and the commercial reality. But it's clear to us that we can develop a sustainable biofuel that is commercially viable, because the reality of it is the market will price the fuel. You're not going to produce a biofuel that's cheaper than kerosene, because you'd be crazy to sell it that way. You're going to sell it at the same price as kerosene, or kerosene will be sold at the same price as biofuel. It's going to be a market. The thing is to get scale, and that's why airlines do have a role to play. The role we're playing is both as an equity investor in the project, and what really makes it work is we guarantee to take the product. So that means the other people who are putting their equity in have have a clear understanding that they have a customer who's going to buy the product, and that gives them the incentive to invest. And more we're seeing that with airlines, where they're prepared, if not to put equity in, they are prepared to say, well, we're going to take the product that you produce.
Yeah, which is obviously very important, because one of the things that I do want to get to talk about is how do we pay for all of this? I mean, the smart aleck question I could put to you, Willie, is do you think you should pay for your own externalities, which is effectively what we're talking about here, isn't it? Paying for the cost of putting the carbon into the air. You're investing in various things, but I haven't seen any airline knock back any free offer of a bit of government subsidy for all this.
No, and nobody knocks back free money or a subsidy from government. NGOs take money from governments, so everybody does. If it's available, you'd be crazy to say, sorry, I don't want it. Now, if you're taking it and there's a commitment to do something that you don't fundamentally agree with, well, then you're not going to take it. And our argument was, why provide a financial incentive to produce a biofuel for road transport that, as Bill says, isn't working, and yet not provide the same incentive for aviation where we know we can make something work. And we have a greater incentive to make it work, because there isn't going to be the electrical or the hybrid electrical solution in the short term for us. There will be a solution, but it's not going to be in the sort of time frame that we're looking at to make a difference.
Very much. I think the time window for all of us with the cycle that Patrick very well mentioned, I think we at Airbus look at the years until 2023, 2025 to do all the test bed thinking, testing to come with, this is something there is a technology that should be ready for the future for decarbonized aircraft. Level of decarbonization still to be confirmed depending on the technology. And that will come through the development later by the 2030s, 2035, something like that, not much earlier. Definitely with the breakthrough technologies that we want to introduce. So offset is the first step that states have put together with ICAO. The very first one, not enough, but the first one. Well, no, sorry, it's not the first one. In the ATAG route, we took our commitments in the last 10 years and we overshot our commitments. There is a second commitment to come, is supporting the offset, and this is starting, so it will be the success. I'm quite impressed to see already 80 airlines covering 75% of the traffic, international traffic, voluntarily applying to it. The third step is obviously biofuels and sustainable fuel. And this is what needs to be developed until to reach the quite demanding objective. It's not yet net zero emission, but achieving 50% reduction in the emission by 2050 compared to what we have is a commitment we want to stick to. And sticking to the commitment requires effort. And maybe we need to revisit the commitments with the experience we work. I'm a man from program management. I like to measure, and I like to verify the progress, and I like to make sure that we can build on what we have done and improve in this way.
But I think there's an interesting point there. You're absolutely right. We came out with CORSIA as an industry early, but now I think time's marched on, hasn't it? I mean, and here is I take your point, Willie, that the airlines and the airports aren't necessarily in the same industry, but the airlines have gone out with CORSIA, which is we'll sort of kind of do our best to come down to 2005 levels by 2050, give or take, international only, not domestic, blah, blah, blah. And yet here is the ACI today saying we're going to have zero carbon by 2050. Now that may be aspirational, but isn't it better to have a really hard aspirational target to strive towards? And is it maybe time for us to go back and be a little bit cynical in the way in which we look at CORSIA and try to either refresh it or substantially rework it? Bill, you're looking quizzical. What's or is that just your resting face?
I have a deal for you.
Oh, yeah?
Right? I promise not to talk much about fuel tax if the rest of the panel don't talk much about CORSIA.
No, I'm sorry, I really want to talk about fuel tax.
Because the reality about CORSIA and in relation to fuels is that the price of offsets is always much cheaper than alternative fuels. And so all the work that's been done in ICAO is really for naught because there isn't the incentive there. It's interesting that the government of Spain, the government of France, the government of Norway, and the government of Sweden and start talking about alternative fuel targets within their market. And I think that's telling us something, that that's the way to go to solve the problem of the price gap. There is a role for incentives. Remember that under the Innovation Fund of the EU ETS, there's up to 8 billion or more revenue taken from the auctioning of allowances that goes into the Innovation Fund. And, you know, aviation is pretty smart at getting hold of every dollar they can find coming from Brussels. That there's money there to start subsidizing and building both these biofuel factories and power-to-liquid factories, right? But ultimately, it's going to require...
Aren't they doing that? Aren't they trying to get...
Well, the third phase of the Innovation Fund didn't work very well, and the fourth phase starts next year, and I have at least $1 billion to start with. And so we look forward to the aviation industry, and it's a fuel refiner's issue more than an airline issue or a manufacturer issue. Come forward with projects to get these factories built, and then start having a small target. The issue is if you put a target just on Spain, or France, which they're talking about, it's on outbound, fuel uplifted on outbound flights. If I was running Iberia, I would go crazy because the burden is going to be more on the largest carrier in that country and the other ones coming in will be less. So pretty quickly it becomes a discussion, what do you need to do across the whole market? And I think you can have a realistic small target starting on biofuels and power-to-liquid across Europe on all outbound flights. The obligation is not on airlines, the obligation is on the fuel suppliers, just as it was 10 or 15 years ago that they had to reduce the sulfur content of road fuel, and if they didn't, there was a crime and they would go to prison, and of course they all did. So you get some incentives to get these factories going, and then the mandate starts to increase the blend percentage. The price unfortunately goes up. Someone said at the last session, that it's all about price. I'm not sure that it's going to be all about price in the future. I think it's going to be about what needs to be done in order to get these zero or close to zero carbon fuels to market.
I've got two comments there, and they both come back to you, Patrick. First of all, does EASA have the ability to actually put people in prison? If they, just out of interest, because I'd like to know that anyway, just generally. But then secondly, if what Bill's saying is right, we have to start to push the consumers to have a bigger say in this, or at least a bigger hand in this, aren't we? And I happen to know that you are looking at turning aeroplanes into fridges, effectively, with a little star rating. Yes. First of all, do you see a role for EASA in fuel development?
Okay.
And then secondly, talk about the eco-taxi.
Right. So, but the answer to your first question is that EASA cannot put people to jail.
But you've given him an idea.
but certainly a very good idea, Philippe. Let's think about it. I think on those fuel issues, one of the issues is that the aviation community at large is not the master of its own future on this. We depend on the suppliers. We depend on the suppliers of oil, or fuel. We see that in our case because we worked a lot with Rolls-Royce, Safran, and Boeing and Airbus on biofuels and is it safe? What is the performance and so on and so forth. And I can say that there is no problem from our side. So in terms of safety, in terms of performance, there is no problem in using biofuels. So that means that the problem is elsewhere, and it's not in the airline. It's an economic problem, yes. And it is also a supply chain problem, which is beyond our direct control, and that's one of the difficulties that we have. There is a lot of money which is available in the EU system for biofuels, including for aviation, but indeed it's very difficult to grab it because we can't find the right alliances and the right mix of people to work together on a common project. Maybe with your initiative, we may have incentives to do better, but as far as we are concerned, we don't see any major problem, technical problem. Now, we conducted a survey with passengers, independent survey with passengers, 6,000 of them, because with the new EASA regulation, our role in the environment has been reinforced. Okay? And we were wondering how to position ourselves, what would be meaningful for the citizens. And there came a number of surprises out of this survey. First of all, 97% of the people who were surveyed ignored the real contribution of aviation to CO2 emissions. For them, it's above 20%, for instance, or most of them. Because, and the typical answer that we got was, look at the fumes, smoke, but the aircraft, which is, it's water. And we try to explain to them. So I think there is really a misperception from the public on the actual environmental performance of aviation. I'm not saying that we should consider that therefore we shouldn't do anything, but there is a misperception there. Second, and that's I think a key trend in our field, the consumers are becoming smarter and smarter. And they make choices which are based on price, and it was confirmed to us that for them the price was the highest priority. But then they also considered, of course, convenience, and I'm not going to start again the discussion of last panel, but if within a given price range they can do something which is good for environment, they would rather do it. Okay, so if they are given a choice with almost equivalent prices, and if they have a proof or an information that one choice is better for the environment than the other, they will choose the one which is better for the environment. That's one thing. And the second thing is that they are asking to know what is better for the environment or not. And based on all this, we started, but it was some time ago, 2 years ago, so I'm not surfing on the sustainability surf wave. We started to work on the notion of eco-label. Because in fact, what the idea that we had was to say, whenever you buy a fridge, you have the AA+, label when you buy the fridge. And why can't we have something similar for our products? And one of the key difficulties is that if you want to have something similar, it has to be based on a transparent data, transparent methodology, so that it's undisputable. And we have that. We do the environmental certification of engines and aircraft. We have all the emission data, NOx, noise, and so on and so forth. So we could actually have this kind of ranking or labeling of aircraft. And then, that's not necessarily the most interesting part for a consumer, for a passenger. The most interesting part is, the airport at which they are going to take off or land, the airline, and less for the passengers, but possibly for our industry, the air navigation service provider. So basically, the mandate that I received from my board was to develop, for the end of this year, a pilot eco-label for aircraft, and we are working with Airbus and with Boeing on this. In parallel to that, we will develop a similar eco-label for airports, airlines, and air navigation service providers, and that's an offer for any voluntary candidates who want to work with us on this. That would be very, very useful. And the goal is that we develop more information which would be provided to the passengers when they make their choice of a service to go from A to B.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm not exactly sure yet I know how the information gets to the passengers, but let me start perhaps with you, Andrew. Does that encourage you? Does that scare you?
It certainly doesn't scare me. I think we have in addition to having let's call it a environmental issue and an issue of physics and engineering, we have a communication issue here as well. And we are not, there's an element of this where maybe not getting the credit for the good things we are doing, but that's almost by the by.
But that's a communication point.
Yeah, when we've got a place where we've got Emma Thompson in the middle of Oxford Circus saying don't fly, we're slipping into a place where the enemy's becoming flying, not carbon. And if we could get some clarity of, first of all, statistics and measurement, because we've got different people quoting different things all over the place, and if we could get some authority behind that and everybody can be measuring in the same way and consumers can start to trust that, that's got to be a good thing. And then absolutely back to the point before, when you start to measure things, you can start to make progress. So, you know, we see that, we for example, we issue the statistics in terms of environmental impact and emissions and noise and so forth in and out of Heathrow, and we see airlines then able to respond to that. And, you know, the latest charter we issued, actually, British Airways was coming top of the league table because of various things they'd done in terms of continuous descent and you know, other improvements they'd made. So you can start to see action once you've got that. And I also think there's more to be done by us as a collective, as a sector, to help consumers think about, for example, offsetting and how they do that, and help think about the choices that they're making as they go. Because on the research we see anyway, there is at least a segment of the market out there that absolutely wants to know the impact they're having and will make choices, at least at the margin, based upon what that's going to mean. And
So
that's got to be part of the mix.
So do you see it as a competitive element, that you can start to use it, fly out of Heathrow because we're environmentally better than Gatwick? No disrespect to Gatwick, obviously, but and if so, how would you promote that? I mean, are we talking putting stickers on the edges of aeroplanes by the door? How do we get this from this really quite, I mean this in the nicest possible way, this quite arcane conversation amongst ourselves, industry players, to the point that Patrick was making, which is that it's actually going to have to be the passenger that we have to convince in all of this?
I think there's no harm in competition between airlines, but between airports, to do more and do better. That's always got to be a good thing. If I'm really honest, I think we're not going to get consumer cut through with a sticker by the plane or an ad in the airport or individual efforts. I think to really get the consumer cut through, we need something that's bigger and broader, and we need to be telling a story where we're all driving at the same messages. Because if I'm the average traveller, the amount of time I'm giving to this in my brain is pretty small.
Well,
and you have to get that message through that says flying is a fantastic thing and the enemy here is carbon, not flying, and here's what we're doing about it and here's what you can do about it.
I think there are two things there, though, aren't there? I mean, yes, we have to get that cut through as a communication thing. I don't dispute that. I'll come to that in a minute. But we've also got the fact that when I'm booking a ticket, that's when I actually make a decision. You know, either through Heathrow or not, on BA or not, or whatever. So, Willie, as an airline, would you welcome putting that sort of data on your webpage or on the edge of your airplane?
I think the critical issue is that the data has to be consistently applied. Everybody has to apply the rules in a consistent fashion.
Can I introduce you to Mr. Patrick Key?
Yeah, no, but to be honest, the risk here is that you know, everybody runs off doing their own things, or several different groups with responsible labels start doing their own thing, and that they don't line up. And I think this is what's happening today. So people become more confused. And I think the risk is that, you know, good initiatives get dismissed in the noise of all of the not so good initiatives that are thrown out there. You know, Patrick and I have discussed this. I think the key to me is, you know, so what's the criteria? How are you going to assess it? And can you do this on a consistent basis? Because, you know, a 747 flying between Dublin and London is not an efficient use of a 747. A 747 flying between Dublin and Singapore is clearly a better and more efficient use of a 747. So how do you know, you say the aircraft is one thing, how you use the aircraft is another, how it's flown through the sky through various ANSP providers is another thing, you know, how it's operated by an individual airline. So that, you know, if that aircraft is being fueled by a biofuel as opposed to you know, today's jet kerosene, it's all very different. So how do we bring all of this together in a way that is genuinely informative? But I think information is important, and you know, we can say it's important today. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it's going to be 10, 100 times, 1,000 times more important. And that's the issue. We've got to prepare the ground for, you know, for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whatever. But it has to be done in a way that's going to be critically accepted and not open to abuse. And yeah, therefore, you know, I do welcome, Patrick and I have spoken about this, you know, I welcome a body like EASA doing it, because EASA does have a reputation and has a responsibility, and therefore I think can do it. But there's a lot of inputs that need to be made before people would be prepared to accept that this is the best way of classifying an aircraft, an airline, an ANSP, an airport. And I'm not sure. I think competition, I think there is an element for competition. But quite honestly, I think now it's collaboration we need. You know, I think competition can come into play at a future date. I think we really need collaboration now, because some of what I see that's being presented today in the name of competition is actually misleading, and I don't think it's progressing the issue in a positive way at all. So I'd be much more inclined to say let's collaborate, let's work together to get to an answer, and then when we're satisfied that we've got all of the criteria firmly established, then let's compete the hell out of one another, which is what we do anyway.
I think when we were offered to come into this idea and project, we welcomed EASA as well as certainly the most competent place with the recognition that is needed. Our recommendation to EASA is that it's important, needs to come. We need to make sure we sort of make pilot phase of what it is on the product. Then you need to incorporate a very broad range of airlines, airports in the future, so that there is time to think about it, to think at all the elements that Willie mentioned, because we want it to be a global level playing field for everybody. So come from European initiative, make sure it influences the whole international sector. I don't want to see labels everywhere. I think it makes little sense. We have to make sure it applies to all sorts of aircrafts, the flying ones, not just the new ones, otherwise you will not discriminate much. And I think it introduces the idea that you briefly mentioned before of a perspective of making sure that the sustainability aspect is embedded on all sorts of the end-to-end life of the aircraft. And this is the life cycle assessment of all our products with all the actors in the chain, which we very much push. By the way, our friends from the C-Series have done some good work with the A220 development on those life cycle aspects that we are interestingly looking at as well at Airbus, welcoming them on board. In the future, look at the overall, from climate to circular economy, all those aspects are linked. The end of life of the aircraft you mentioned, we've been pushing with the support of Europe, Pamela project, by the way, and giving birth to Tarmac as a recycling end-of-life company. Tarmac is an interesting business model that allows us to reach today 92% of weight of the aircraft recycled, which will well above anyone. And I think we welcome the ambition to make sure that till the end of the life of the aircraft, we put demanding requirements. We don't want to be in a situation where the maritime sector is today with what happens to the end of life of those aircrafts in remote countries. There are many ways to make it very well.
It's an interesting question. It's apropos of nothing, but an interesting question. Historically, in the maritime industry, when a ship's got to the end of its life, they just sink it. It's a bit harder to suggest that for the aviation industry, isn't it? It's just drop it out of the sky.
Although you've seen some cases where it's been done recently.
Bill.
Transparency is key, and these ideas about eco-labelling, I think, are extremely important. In other industries, you can't buy a car now, you can't buy a fridge, you can't rent an apartment or buy an apartment without having an eco-label. And I think the problem with aviation has been that the information hasn't been there. Now, with the ICAO CO2 standard, metric values for all aircraft, in production as well as new, that information is there. I don't want to be controversial, but industry have made sure that all the key information is not going to be published, like the SAR values, which would really make a comparison valid. That could be done and it should be changed. Just to note that Europe has been the first, as of the end of this month, in the next couple of weeks, Europe will publish the efficiency values of all new and existing ships calling at EU ports, measuring the efficiency based on the cargo carried, not the empty or the theoretical load factor, of all ships, and roughly 60 or 70% of the world's ships call at European ports. All that information you'll see on our website very soon. And the industry hate it, and IMO lock all that information up. But Europe has done the initiative on shipping, and there's no reason why they can't do this initiative on aviation. So, but transparency also brings this issue. that it's not just transparency on CO2 emissions, it's transparency on the non-CO2 emissions, which we know are greater. There's a question about it, but there's no doubt they are greater than the CO2 emissions. So it's time for Europe to put some money to solve the equivalency issue between CO2 and non-CO2 emissions, and then come up, not an eco label, I think you would agree, Willie, you said, not an eco label on an aircraft, because it's a way also that you use the aircraft that will determine how efficient it is, right? Yeah. So Atmosphere is trying to do that in Germany, and that's a good start. We need transparency of the airlines and their operations, and CO2 and non-CO2.
So just to make sure I understand it right, the shipping data that you're talking about to come online is not just by vessel, but by actual journey.
And load factor.
Which therefore imputes load factor, of course. So to put that into an airline context, you'd need the airframe, obviously, and then, of course, you'd need the load factor. Well, you'd be more than happy to give these guys your load factor flight by flight.
No, but we do. It's available. But here you go. How do you measure load factor? So we measure load factor by the number of commercially occupied seats on the aircraft. Other people measure load factor by the number of seats sold, not by the number of seats occupied. There's two different measures. And people in the industry don't know that there are airlines reporting it differently. Even though it's absolutely clear that they are reporting it differently, they compare load factor of one airline to load factor of another when they're comparing apples and oranges. Well, and this is my point that I said to Patrick. There's got to be one way of defining what load factor is. Load factor was traditionally, depending passenger load factor, it's RPKs divided by ASKs. ATKs divided by RTKs divided by ATKs. That's not how a number of airlines measure the load factor.
But Willie, you pay APD on every outbound flight, right? That's a pretty good indication of load factor, right? So let's encourage every airline leaving Europe to pay a ticket tax, and then we'll know exactly what the load factors are.
Okay, and let's make the tax 1 cent, and let's use that tax raised to be, let's hypothecate it
for environmental
let's spend
purposes.
The APD on the problem then.
Fine, your UK taxpayers, I think you have a government, talk to them.
Oh, well, I'm not sure we have one at the moment.
That's a very moot point.
And just to be clear, although I am a UK taxpayer, I'm an Irish EU citizen, and will continue to be after Brexit.
You don't pay tax in Ireland?
No, I pay my tax in the UK. I'm employed in the UK. And by the way, maybe this is another debate. Maybe panelists should be forced everywhere to disclose their tax certificates so that we all know who pays tax and what they do. I'd be delighted to disclose fully what I pay in tax. I am a taxpayer. I pay tax in the UK is where I work and where I'm employed, and I've no problem with paying my tax. What I do have a problem with is people who want to generate more taxes and waste that money. So if you're going to generate taxes to improve the environmental performance of X, Y, or Z, I don't mind whether it's my industry or somebody else's, let's use that money to improve the environmental performance. Let's not take that money and spend it somewhere else.
Unfortunately, that, if you'll pardon this terrible pun, that train's left, or that ship's left the dock, though. That's called hypothecation.
No, but it hasn't. It hasn't. That's like saying that for everything that was argued previously, you can no longer argue it going forward. That's bollocks. Just because the argument wasn't accepted means we haven't won the argument yet. It doesn't mean we've given up on the argument.
No, I completely agree with that. But it is, let me assure you, like pushing rice uphill at the moment, because there was a meeting last week in The Hague. I wanted to keep going on this subject, but we're now talking about tax, so let's talk about tax. There was a meeting last week in The Hague of finance ministries, or organised by the Dutch Finance Ministry, and finance ministry personnel came to that meeting. There were practically no aviation people at that meeting. Indeed, Philippe and I think, were the only two people at the entire meeting. Even Bill, as an NGO, wasn't invited into the meeting. And I raised the point at some point about, surely if we're trying to decarbonise, any money that's collected has to go towards getting it decarbonised. And there's a rude Australian expression I could use at this point. It was fair to say that wasn't the most popular suggestion. Bastard on Father's Day is sort of where you're going here. The finance ministries are not very keen on anything other than simply all the money coming into the exchequer and then them being in charge of how they distribute it. So we've got a seriously difficult task to change their minds on that. So let's go back to the topic that's been pushed around a number of times today as well already, which is how do we change the narrative? We've got a good story, we've had a good story, and yet we seem to have relied on ATAG. ATAG, ladies and gentlemen, is IATA's diffusion brand, right? It's just IATA writ another way. And every now and then they have an away day. It's like an IATA away day for ATAG. It doesn't appear to be cutting through. It doesn't appear to be making anything. Willie, you're on the Board of Governors of IATA.
No, I was. I'm no longer.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry. From your experience on the Board of Governors, though, is ATAG the answer?
No, I think, to be fair, I think ATAG... I'm disappointed. I don't think ATAG has developed in the way that I would have expected it to have developed. And I think the story coming from ATAG looks very much the same today as it did 10 years ago. And the story,
years ago.
yeah, and it should have changed by then. The one thing I would say, I spent 13 years in the Board of Governors of IATA, and I can remember December 2006 at a Board of Governors meeting I'm pretty much sure it was in Geneva. I raised this issue of environmental performance and taxation, and quite honestly, 31 people sit on the Board of Governors, 32 now. It was met with blank faces, with the exception of a few, principally European airline CEOs who engaged in the debate. So that was 2006, December 2006. I remember it distinctly because I made this big speech, thought this is great, everybody's going to wound up now. And a few European CEOs agreed. Rest of them sort of said, okay, what time is lunch? The fascinating thing about it was a year later, I got a call from one of the CEOs who'd been at that meeting, and he asked me if I would go and give a presentation to his management team on environmental issues. Because he said for the first time in his career, he had been asked a question about the environment, and he was unable to answer it. Now, that was 2006, 2007. You look at it today, it's very, very different today. You go to the Board of Governors of IATA today, you've got 32 people there, and environment is very, very much central to the discussion that that takes place. I don't think ATAG has kept pace with that development. I think if I went to an ATAG meeting in 2006, which I did, but I don't go to ATAG meetings today because I haven't seen the evolution in ATAG that I would have hoped to have seen. So I think you're absolutely right. I think we need to do a lot better, and we need to wake up and engage more openly. And to be honest, we enjoy having a good discussion and a good debate around these issues. We just need to do more of it, and there needs to be more honesty about the debate than maybe we've had in the past.
Well, we enjoy having the conversation, but we have it with ourselves. And that's the problem. I mean, we don't seem to be able to talk outside of ourselves.
Well, I think we do a bit more of that than we used to. Certainly I can speak from IAG and BA in particular, where we do engage with people who disagree with us and try and debate it. We don't succeed in engaging maybe as constructively as I would like to think, but I think there is a role for us to play, and I think we do have to get the communication better. Yeah. But to communicate, you have to understand the issue. You have to, and the issue is much better understood by the industry today at the most senior level than it was 10 years ago. I can tell you. I speak to CEOs. You can see the debate at IATA, which has moved on significantly in the past 10 years, and is very much focused on this because we recognise that we have to do something better than we've done in the past. And, CORSIA, I've described CORSIA as a good first step. I don't think CORSIA is the answer.
No.
I think it's a good first step. I think we achieved something that no other industry was able to achieve. And I was in the middle of arguing within IATA about it. I think we did that. That, to me, is progress. I think we've got to recognise and accept that it is progress and it's a step in the right direction. It is not the answer. I'm not going to sit here and try and tell you that our problems are resolved because of CORSIA. They're not. And to me, it was always envisaged that CORSIA would be developed. Now, maybe the pace of development and the timescale for development, it doesn't meet with what Bill would want, but there will be more stages of development of that.
But the mood music, sorry, I'll come to you in a second. The mood music coming out of the IATA AGM just 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago was was not that Corsair was a good first step, but we need to move on. It was, here's the answer is Corsair.
No, I don't think it was, to be honest. I think you will get some people who will say that, but you've got to remember, you bring it together the views of 240, 250 airlines globally, and not everybody is in the same place, but everybody is in a much more advanced place than they were 10 years ago. Much more advanced, and I've no doubt we'll continue to make that progress.
If I may, I'm brand new into the environmental domain. I'm only there for a year and a half at Airbus, my view, and I may have a recent view. My view since the ATAC summit have been last year and this year is a real sense of acceleration. Understanding and acceleration of the problematic. The question is how, but my vision is we mentioned it, we need to stick together, not just the airports, not just the airlines, and we see how difficult it may be, but if we want to improve all our operations, carry on with building the solutions that we need and making it work worldwide, this is the one planet that we are looking at, and this is the one international aviation that we need to work. So leading pace from Europe, showing the example, the way to go is a great pride to be sitting in Europe, not to the risk of separating to the commitment to the rest of the world. So it may be slow, but it is progressing, and I have not heard anyone saying Corsair is the solution. Corsair is a step that everybody wants to secure at ICAO, because it could still stumble somewhere. So let's make sure this is it, because it's a first step, and definitely work on the future steps. Biofuel developments. We've been dying for biofuel procurement. I want to fly my very small airline, ATI Beluga, with biofuel on board. I have to work with Air Total, Air BP. We have conversation trying to secure an increase of feedstock of procurement.
Just before we move on to that, though, Andrew, is Heathrow a member of ATAC?
We're involved with ATAC, yes.
What's your vision of all this? Are you as optimistic as we?
I think our sense is that there is much more awareness across the industry, all parts of the supply chain, and there is much more willingness to keep moving. But people do move at a different pace, absolutely. Again, I'd come back to the point of there probably is more we could be doing to get cut through as well. I think you also said before we were talking to ourselves. I'm not sure that's entirely true either. Speaking for ourselves, we are involved in quite a lot of activity across business and across sectors in the UK context as well, and I see that rising right across industry. This is not just an aviation piece as well. I think we've got to be. I mean, you previously were talking about being a bit cynical about Corsair and so forth. It's not the end solution to the problem, but it is a step in the right direction. I think and this is not about just either or. This is about, okay, and what next? And so partly what you see with ourselves in terms of saying, well, by next year we'll be carbon neutral, and by 2050 we'll be carbon zero carbon, is saying we're not quite sure how we get there, but we can do our bit, and it's calling on everybody else to start to think about that as well. And I think, if you think of ICAO and so forth, I think there's an opportunity. I think the next ICAO meeting's in the autumn, isn't it? Yeah. September, something like that. An opportunity maybe there to start thinking about, well, what is the next step beyond that? It'll take some more time to get there. It's not a matter of snap your fingers and, right, we've got it all sorted and move on. But there is an opportunity there to start thinking about where the next goal is. Because even if you don't know all the stops to getting there, setting yourself a target and collectively setting ourselves a target and sticking together around it has got to be the way that you make progress.
Well, let me come back to that. I mean, the point, I think I made it before, the airports, by saying let's go carbon zero by 2050, aspirational, no disrespect, aspirational, is that something that maybe the rest of the industry should pick up on? Or do you think it's silly to take a view like that?
Well, I think it's for the other parts of the industry to figure out what they think is, technically and commercially viable. It's interesting, for us at Heathrow only, it resonates because you've got the UK saying net zero for the entire economy by 2050. So it kind of lines up in terms of ambition there.
But this is what I say, there's the airport industry, there's the airline industry, there's the engine industry. They're not the same. So if I look at airports saying, net zero by 2050, why not? Why wait to 2050 if you think you can do it? Do it sooner than that. I know that I can get to net zero at a cost. And I haven't mapped that out yet. We have mapped out the commitment that we have given, and we know we can get there. Mm-hmm. And there's a combination of factors. But can I sit here and say airlines can get to net zero in 2050? The answer is simple: yes, at a cost. But what's that cost going to do to the industry? And there's no way everyone in the industry will embrace that until they understand what this means for them, because otherwise there'll be some airlines saying, well, we're out of business. Yeah. So there are solutions. We've got to bring everybody together. And I think that's where, give IATA and ICAO some credit. I think we have succeeded in bringing people together on this. Now, keeping them together is going to be important. And then accelerating the pace at which that movement is moving, I think will be a positive development.
Yeah. Patrick, what's the role of the EASA to try to go to these sorts of targets?
So in the reinforced role of EASA, we are tasked to
without prison sentencing.
With or without.
We will. No, we are tasked to monitor the environmental performance of the system. And I insist on it. I need to come back to the air navigation service provision, because I think that's one of the topics that we need to discuss about. So each of the actors in the aviation community have to play their role, and they have to have their share of making the aviation world more efficient from an environmental perspective. So we have to publish every 2 years an environmental report. We just did one at the beginning of 2019 with recommendations to the EU institutions on what needs to be done. Okay, and it's a factual report, on what was the level of emissions, how did we perform in different sectors, what are the prospects of new technologies, new operational procedures, and so on and so forth. So this is something that I think can help. We are working together with the industry on all the new technologies, because when we talk about hybrid propulsion, it's much more than just putting an electrical engine to compensate for the fuel engine. It has to come with a lot of new operational procedures for the pilots, how to manage the energy, structural work, and it's very complex, in fact. So it's easier said than done. We are working with the smaller aviation, general aviation, which is going to be, I think, a pioneer in this domain.
Good test bed.
And a good test bed. To be very frank with you, in terms of technologies, we still need to mature the technology on the batteries, and batteries have the tendency to catch fire, which is, on an aircraft, I'm not sure that's something that we want.
Bit of a downside.
Yes. Yeah. There are questions about the voltage, high voltage in an aircraft. How do we deal with that from a safety perspective? So it's much more complex than it seems. And so we are working with the industry to do that, with engine manufacturers, with the OEMs. We are working on operational procedures which would be needed in order to deal with these new power sources. And there we have to work with our international colleagues, with ICAO, with the FAA and the likes. So it's going to take a lot of time. In terms of air navigation service provision, if I may.
Hooray!
Yes. We hear a lot of target setting for the airlines, for the OEMs, for the airports, but I think air traffic management needs to be part of the equation. And
so why aren't they?
So
read the Court of Auditors report out yesterday, it will tell you.
Yeah, well, indeed.
6 billion down the drain.
Yeah, but that's something different. I think.
Yes.
So, just to give you an example, we have capacity bottlenecks in terms of air traffic management capacity, and we had a very bad summer last year. It's very likely that we will have a bad summer this year, and we know what the bottlenecks are. And in order to deal with it, because I think, if I recall correctly, the average delay per delayed flight was of 50 minutes, I think.
17, I think. Yeah.
Yes, which is huge when you think about when you think about it.
The longest one was more than 6 hours.
Yes, which is disgrace. So we know that there is going to be a huge impact on delays, and in order to solve those issues, Eurocontrol, the network manager, did a fantastic job of rerouting flights to avoid bottlenecks. But nobody asked them what is the carbon footprint of those rerouting.
Oh, we have.
You have?
Yeah.
Yes. But so we have an impact in terms of delay, the number of minutes which were saved of delays. But in terms of overall consumption of CO2 emissions, we don't have that clear an idea about how much it's going to cost to the industry. That just illustrates the fact that you need to take account of air traffic management, not only the capacity, but also the environmental performance of air navigation service providers, which I think has been overseen or not seen enough with enough details in the past. Yes, yes.
This is pure waste in the system, some of this.
Sure is.
The irrationalities in the way that some of the airspace is set up and run and so forth. It's consumer waste, it's adding cost, but it's also just burning fuel that doesn't need to be burnt. And it has been calculated out a number of times.
I'm sure Willie can tell you precisely in his fuel uplift.
Yeah,
I think this could have some real consumer cut-through, because certainly, again, if you look at the UK context, one of the reasons why you don't get some of the airspace change is every time you try and do it, there's a town hall meeting and a bunch of people get upset about the planes moving around. If there was more understanding that some of these changes could stop the planes circling and burning fuel, and that is part of the sustainability agenda, maybe that would help in terms of balancing that out. We need to get the message that is pure waste, and that is part of the way you make another one of these steps towards zero carbon is by making these changes happen, because the inertia in the system there is just, it's deadly.
But some of the inertia in the system is this. I'm going to risk being misquoted here. There's such an obsession with safety. There's such an obsession with not just safety, but duplicative layers of safety and so forth. I mean, Willie's aircraft could control themselves from about a centimetre beyond their wingtips. They could self-separate for almost all purposes. We could do a whole bunch of things to fix the system quite quickly, but we've got these people in Cologne called the ACI that are part of the problem.
I wouldn't accept that, actually. I don't think it's done. I'd say it's more political than safety. I think safety is sometimes used by people who don't have an argument to make. They throw out this safety.
You mean the controllers?
They throw out the safety card and say these changes are unsafe. The reality of it is we have an ATC environment that has largely been unchanged since before I started flying. I look at airways today, and they're the same as when I started flying 40 years ago.
Oh, we control aeroplanes as if it's 1955.
Yeah, the navigation equipment, that I had on my first 737 when I flew it was an NDB and a VOR, and in lots of airports we didn't even have ILSs. I look at what we have today and how we can fly and navigate the aircraft. It's so much more efficient, and yet we're still flying pretty much exactly the same routes as we flew when I started 40 years ago, and those routes were in place long before I started flying.
And I completely agree with you.
And it's not safety.
I didn't say it was only safety.
Yeah, I think there's a large degree of politics that's come into play in this.
So why can't we get the politics to shift?
Well, to be honest with you, again, I come back to what I said earlier. We haven't yet won the argument. I think we have to keep making the argument. We have to keep reinforcing the message that there is a political solution to these problems. And, people talked at the earlier presentation about hypocrisy. We've got to call out the hypocrites when they are being completely hypocritical about what's going on. Yeah, and there is a real strong case now, if there wasn't one before, to do this in the interest of the environment. And I'm not saying let's try and get more aircraft into the sky. What I'm saying is very simple. Let's get the aircraft that's in the sky today operating in a more efficient manner. You know, let's do it for that reason. And if that is the focus, you know, I think huge improvements can be made. You know, because Patrick has said, you know, it's not just the rerouting that takes place where we're flying longer routes. It's the fact that we're flying 10, 15, 20,000 feet lower than we should be flying, which is an incredible waste of fuel. And, you know, the CO2 that's been produced as a result of that. And then, you know, you get into the conflicting arguments of, you know, if you don't do this, then you're being penalised from EU 261. So, you know, there's so many different pressures on the airlines that actually causes us to do things that in some cases does not make sense. You know, if we could rationally stand back and say, well, you know, we're not going to do this, it would make more sense. But I think the politics of this has got to be exposed.
So to get what Andrew was calling cut through, do we need to organise a meeting with Greta Thunberg? Is that the solution? I mean, we've got to get the people who are currently out there on the streets to understand these issues, don't we? To make them our leverage point to get some of these political changes to happen.
Yeah, I think we've got to do it first, and you know, there's no point in us trying to pass the problem on to somebody else when it's our problem.
I wasn't suggesting passing the problem on, but I think it's a bit of judo, isn't it, to get that current anger that's out on the streets working in our favour.
Our experience of the political engagement is, yes, you do need to reach out and have some uncomfortable conversations. There are plenty of people in the industry who are doing that or trying to do that. We could do more of it. You may never get to the Greta Thunbergs of the world because a number of people won't actually engage with you. But everybody you can engage with, there's usually a zone of people who can be challenging and uncomfortable but are prepared to talk and prepared to engage. And then you've just got to put in the hard yards in terms of engagement. And particularly through the political system, you've got to come with solutions and which things that work for a political mindset to make some of these work. If we want to get flight paths changed, we've got to actually respond as well to some of the concerns you then get on the ground and actually come to politicians with some of those solutions and do that in a collaborative way. And that's a long, hard slog. That's not just a case of, right, we've got one killer slogan and it's going to cut through. But I think it is possible. It is possible to see that movement begin to happen, even in really intractable things like, you know, airspace over London and things of that sort.
Bill? I mean, I think some of these problems with ATM are clearly to do with more dialogue and policy engagement are needed, but I'd like to widen that point. You mentioned the conference in The Hague last week. I'm not here really not to score points, and I don't want to talk about taxation. But I think that meeting of 29 countries, well over 100 governments, officials, ministers and experts, and industry and us out of the room, which was probably no bad thing, was probably the most important thing that's happened to European aviation on the policy side in the last 10 years. And I think we need to take heed that there's a much greater need. We need to stop yelling at each other through press releases and whatever else. It's a dialogue the deaf between people like ourselves and ATAG. That has to stop. We need to talk together. We are trying to get a coalition of the willing, not on, well, on taxation, yes, but a coalition of the willing to get some movement on bringing alternate fuels to the market, and I think that needs to be nurtured. A number of us wrote to Commissioners Bulc and Arias Cañete last year, pleading for a better dialogue in Europe. There is no dialogue between the various parties in Europe on what needs to happen on the environmental challenges that aviation face. We work on all modes of transport and we know what happens in other modes of transport. ICAO is the most secretive organization that you can ever imagine, and that's a problem, but I'm not here to talk about ICAO. I'm here to talk about Europe. Shipping has forums where industry and governments and civil society are brought together. We need a dialogue to sort out air traffic management, to sort out non-CO2 issues, and I hope and I believe that some first step is about to start on that. We need to talk together about how to bring biofuels. Yes, we need to talk about is taxation a good thing? I don't know whether Ryanair is in the room still, but they're complaining that seemingly it's the Dutch government's fault that the transit traffic of KLM is going to be exempt. I can assure you KLM has been very much involved in making sure that it's a ticket tax that's been put forward in Holland and not a fuel tax. A fuel tax has a tax incidence on each sector. You can actually reform ticket taxes so they are taxed on a sectoral basis, and you could solve that. Ryanair and we could solve that problem tomorrow, and if they're in the room, we would be very happy to sit down with them and indeed with all the airlines and work out these issues. But let's stop making arguments and confrontation, and let's sit down together with governments and with the Commission and try and resolve. These issues are now too important that they are not given the highest of priority. And I think the beauty of last week's conference was that you had ministers and people there saying it's time we did something.
Peace, love, brown rice, kerosene. Literally. So if we did have this meeting, what is the one sentence? I'm going to copy someone else's plan here. What is the one sentence, David, that you would take to that meeting? Let's start with you, Hubert, and work our way around. What is the one thing, if you were at that meeting, what would you be saying?
With the people, I think my plea to the governments would be first start and explain what we're at. I was amazed at the Paris Air Show meeting a few French representatives at Assemblée Nationale that they were aware of very little, and we are, I think, to be blamed of not trying to explain better what's happening. So once we try and communicate, the idea that I think is, I'm very much an optimistic, so I would believe in incentives. Incentives towards airlines to renew their fleets, incentive towards sustainable fuel development, be it bio or synthetic, incentives towards research and technology is the way, I think, we confirm that aviation is not the problem, carbon is the problem.
This is one sentence with some very complicated complex punctuation.
French subordinate.
I do love a semicolon.
Having worked in the industry, I think I love it as much as you do. The issue is carbon, and the issue is it's not being anywhere near addressed. And I think the airlines and the airports and the manufacturers in the room know that it has to be resolved, that the pressure that we've been seeing, and there's clearly been an increase in the heat over the last 12 months, and I don't think any of us think it's going to die down. It's going to continue to strengthen. So do we wait or do we start? I think most of the solutions actually have already been identified in the space of less than an hour. It's the political willingness to get together and start to resolve them. They don't come for free, and they're not going to come for free, but aviation prices have come down dramatically over the last 20 years, and I'm not sure that a $9 or a $2 fare to Malaga is in the interests of anybody. There'll need to be some solution. We think aviation can more or less decarbonise in a progressive way which is manageable.
One sentence. Thank you. Andrew.
So I have to try and be shorter, don't I?
Yeah.
I mean, the tagline here is the enemy is carbon, not flying. We've got to land that. And if we all focus on that, then we can do it. I think the other message is optimism. It can be done by 2050, but we've just got to focus.
Excellent. Thank you. Patrick?
Very similar to what Andrew said. Yes, we can, provided that we are given the means and the resources to do it. It can be done.
Thank you. Willie?
Well, I think they've said it. I like the long paragraphs, but we have a problem. Let's work together to sort it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's work together. I think that's a very positive message to end on. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking them. A parade of the pronouns. Thank you very much. Thanks, Willie.
So thank you very much, Andrew. Great job, and I have to say that was a really high quality sort of panel, great insights, great messaging as well. So thank you indeed very, very much. So ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end of our conference today. A couple of points before we sort of round up. Tonight's gala dinner is also featuring the ACI Europe Best Airports Award. It will take place in a unique location, which is the Limassol Marina helipad, and the transport to the gala dinner departs from all the recommended hotels at 6:45. So that's the main timing to remember. 6:45, buses are leaving for the gala dinner. Tomorrow morning, some of you are going to be in the ACI Europe General Assembly from 8:45 to 9:45. The rest of us will join here at 9:45. So enjoy your dinner. See you later.